Hello, everybody. This is my name is Marks. I'm standing in for Brian Lewis. He's one of my colleagues. We're from the Biocomplexity Institute. This is the first time I've ever given a talk where I don't really know the slides at all, so it might be entertaining to you. I have my own favorite slide at the end. I had to save it and put something in. So, and we're not going to talk about climate at all. We're going to talk about what Jonah and I and Brian were talking about was adaptation in real time at a semi-operational academic environment linked with government at the same time, trying to inform government about, well, in this case for us, we're going to talk about our experiences with COVID and the Virginia Department of Health over the last 2.5, 3 years or so. Stephen Eubanks is my colleague, also from the Biocomplexity Institute. He's been doing pandemic kind of research for 20-some years. So please step in if they have any questions I can't answer, ask Stephen, okay? The other piece to it is, besides showing you a case example of our work, the kinds of tools in terms of adaptation and working with the government directly for problems they have in real time, the kinds of tools we have are well adapted for potentially modeling climate change in some way. We can talk about that maybe at the end. We basically do large-scale simulations of populations based on a synthetic population, which fuses lots of data together and simulates forward, a lot of the work, most of it that we'll talk about today, simulates forward what's going to happen to give policymakers an idea of how many cases might you have in the next 4 weeks, what would be the hospitalization rate, do it by county. You could compare scenarios. What if we close schools down? What if we do this, we do that? How will that change the case rate over a short kind of time window? That's the kind of thing. So you can imagine that maybe there's a place for that kind of analytic or something related to simulation of large-scale populations that might be useful. And Stephen can actually maybe tell you if we've done any work in climate so far elsewhere with that technology. I don't know if we have yet. A long time ago. So we've done some work a long time ago, and maybe we'll talk about that later too. But so this is going to be a short, just to give you a flavor of how we worked with the Department of Health in Virginia, some of the lessons learned that we have. Can you all hear me up there okay? Yeah, okay. So get started with that. So we were working with the Department of Health, the Foresight and Analytics Office. Justin Crow and Alex Teleonis were really our contacts, and they really were advocates for our work. We're going to give you a little bit of the history. We're the Biocomplexity Institute. And it started with, right as COVID started, we were asked by the Department of Health at Virginia whether or not they should build field hospitals. They didn't know. I guess if you can just think back to 3 years ago, people didn't know anything, really. I mean, everybody. Right? I was buying chlorine to, I had a stream near where I live. I was buying chlorine to purify the water because I didn't know if we were going to have water. And this is March, right? So things were unknown. The government didn't know what was going to happen. This is one of the first questions they had. So with our modeling results, we gave them an answer that they wanted, that they liked, which is an approximate answer, which is that you have 6 weeks. We can give you a warning potentially of something approximate at 6 weeks. You don't have to plan now to build it. We can give you that much lead time, which for, in the beginning of the pandemic, that's seems like a lot of time. So that started the process, and then they started to ask, could you use those modeling capabilities to answer other kinds of questions? So we started briefing them basically every week on different aspects, genomics, predictions of the number of cases, and so forth. And then while we're doing that, and I'll get to the lessons learned in a couple minutes, the relationship also turned into trying to find other kinds of models. The question with working with government is how do you have a capability, you're doing something that's useful to them, but we're researchers also, we can do other things. We naturally explore, and we naturally have questions, and we have to figure out how to get them interested in questions that might be useful for them that they don't know is useful to them because they don't know those are questions that can be answered. It's a key kind of, maybe I'll just talk about the lessons learned as I go through this because it might be easier that way. That's a key insight that I think we drew from the experience is that you're constantly searching for potentially new avenues in a sense. We're also an academic institution, right, within UVA, so we're also looking for funding. So putting all those together is kind of centered on what's useful to them and trying to provide them with insights into what might be useful for them. Whether it's true or not, we don't know because we have to try something. So the third piece here is about additional requests. And what we found is sometimes we would get onto a thread, they thought it might be useful, it turned out to not be useful, or it turned out to not be possible, for example. If an analytic doesn't work, the data might not be there, it might run out. The data landscape during COVID changed quite a bit as COVID went along. Better data came along, it also went away. And then, so our current plan, now we still are working with them. Now we're kind of switching into a different mode because no one seems to care about COVID that much anymore, right? But as a government agency, they do care, but they have to care in a different way because it's not possible potentially to say to taxpayers that we're going to spend the same amount as during the pandemic, now as we were during the pandemic for certain purposes, because that use might have gone away. But they do need to be prepared. So we're switching into a mode that's thinking 5 to 10 years forward, which is to provide, one possibility is to provide UVA, the Virginia Department of Health with kind of a playbook. What do they do under these conditions? What did we do 5 years ago during COVID? How do you keep that institutional knowledge? That's one of the modes we're into. So I guess that's one lesson, is to think about the future. When you're doing this, I don't know how this applies to climate because it's going to be going on for a long time. It's not necessarily as short term as pandemic, but pandemics are going to come back, so maybe they're more cyclical. So these are just some examples. You can see the slides going here. This is the kind of, we'll give you just a sense of how it worked with VDH. So we gave them a situational assessment. We provided models every week. We provided interpretation and evaluation of the models. We provided them with an analysis of the literature that was new and upcoming per week, not necessarily our own work, but globally, any kind of research findings that might be useful to them. Largely, we focused on cases, hospitalizations, variants of concern, proportion of variance. We started using wastewater and so forth. And this was really, I guess the title of this talk is It Takes Two to Tango. We've become very collaborative with the health department, with the group that we're working with. And it's a pretty large group. And it's really a tribute to their interest in working with us, and we've built a lot of trust. I guess we'll actually talk about that at the end. But this really reflects not just us telling them things, but them asking us and us telling them things and going back and forth and seeing what's useful. And then they took, this is just an example of how they interfaced with the work that we have. They're also responsible for telling the public in some ways what's going on. So they had these links are probably still available. They provided briefings. The briefings that we briefed to them would then be carved into form that could be shared with the public. So that was also part of the deal, is that what you brief to them might go somewhere else. So I guess this is the forward one. I'll just close up with these. These are 6 main points. Engagement, usefulness, and community. These go together, really. We were highly engaged with VDH, and they were engaged with us and went back and forth. There's a community of, there's actually an international community of infectious disease modelers that we've been a part of for a long time. Leveraging that community and also what we've learned from that community with VDH was useful. But I think the key point of these first 3 bullets is it has to be useful for the sponsor, in this case is the government, and you also have to show them what's useful and be willing to drop threads. One thing that came out of this work, I don't know if it was in prior work, Stephen might be able to tell you, but soft data, human judgments came into play quite a bit, directly providing the government with a company called Metaculus that we're working with. Anybody here of Metaculus? They run forecasting competitions with humans. So we built with Metaculus a forecasting system with they have a human panel to try to provide information that we really couldn't get from other data sources. Kind of boots on the ground, intuitions. Think of this as a sensor. What do people think is going to happen? So for example, something about vaccination and we actually would ask questions about when do you think government decisions will be made, things that aren't quite as easy to quantify without kind of a human interpretation in the loop. That data was important, and I don't think as we went into it, we knew that that was going to be part of what we actually reported to the government. The final 2 points are just that explainability and visualizations are really important. The models that we use are very complicated. They're large scale. We can represent millions and millions of people going back and forth to work and doing their thing and interacting, basically building a contact network. Lots of assumptions are in there. So trying to explain and build trust with people who use those models is essential. And visualization, of course, I think everybody is familiar with that idea that you need good visualizations or you can lose people. But these are just some of the lessons that we learned. Some of the challenges were skepticism, lack of trust. In this context in particular, with COVID, I don't know if you remember, but there was lots of competing models internationally trying to predict what's going on. And there was also a lot of public engagement with those models, pro and con, but also within the community there was also engagement pro and con about each other's models and competition too. That was one. I don't know if that's unique. I guess climate change modelers have the same problem. People don't believe them necessarily. You can imagine that. But within the community, I don't know how tight it is, how many models there are. I'm sure they're really large. Maybe there's not a lot of them. But COVID, anybody could really build a model if they wanted to. So, and you know, modern data science and Python allows people to do all kinds of things fast without necessarily a lot of thought. So I think that I'll just give one example of a future possibility. So I'm a psychologist, and the kind of work that I do in the pandemic during COVID was a little bit different with other colleagues within the Institute and other colleagues elsewhere, trying to build systems where we can understand people's beliefs, their attitudes, and something that helps us predict how information ecologies can drive changes in behavior. So that includes, what you see on the right is just a notional thing, but you have a belief hub, media analytics, models of cognition, simulation, and models of populations, very similar to the ones that we use for pandemic forecasts. We'd like, someday I can imagine large-scale pandemic modeling, including these kinds of aspects. But this work alone takes lots of work and technical enablers and new science just to understand populations, you know, any size populations, possibility of changing their sets of beliefs with respect to something like vaccination. But we'd like to integrate those somehow with the modeling we already have. So that layers a new layer of complexity on top of this problem. We already have complex models. To add a new layer, all the questions that all the kind of problems that we've faced with trust, explainability, and so forth, they just get multiplied or some other, whatever the function is. And I think that as you move forward, I guess one of the lessons here is that technology is going to move forward, so you always have this problem of trying to explain the new thing that you're adding to the thing that you used to do to make it better. And so that problem will never go away. So that's my happy ending note. So these are our sponsors, stakeholders, data partners, and colleagues. And you can ask Brian or I or Stephen if you have any questions. Thank you.